My name's Hazem Gaber, and today we're going to learn why PHP sucks or doesn't suck. And in all fairness, it doesn't suck. But I started learning PHP. Actually, I started learning HTML when I was a kid, and then I learned JavaScript. I think I was in grade 8. I was just curious. And then later, when I needed to build some apps, and again, I was still in high school, and so I started learning PHP. My high school was teaching C++, uh, so PHP doesn't suck. It's been around since 1995, and the current version is version 8, which just came out, I think, 2020. 80% of the websites on the internet use PHP, including Facebook, Wikipedia, and Dig, which is a cool site. And it's pretty easy to learn. But uh, people that program with different frameworks like Angular or React or Ruby or whatever, they just think it sucks. They like to point out all the problems that PHP has that their language doesn't have. And so they just think PHP is worse. But every language has its own drawbacks. And the people that use a unpopular language that 2 or 3% of the world uses and don't get much support can't understand why PHP is so much more popular than their language. And people are also looking at, version 4 or version 5 of PHP as opposed to version 7 or version 8. So the reason that PHP was so popular, it really wasn't a programming language, it was more of a templating language. So the idea was I could build an HTML page for a dynamic website as a template, and I could put little PHP scripts within my HTML code. And so when a user came to visit my page, it pulls up a page, the server takes the page and it executes the PHP, and we end up with a pure HTML page. And so we might take some of these details from a database and we send this back to the user. So just think about Facebook. We've got, a login page, that's HTML, and we've got a page that shows, the content, blah, 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 your username, your profile pic, updates from your friends, etc., etc., etc. Those are all stored in a database, and everybody visits the same page but sees different content. And the reason is they pull up the Facebook server pulls up an HTML template in PHP, checks out who the user is, and then there's some other logic here, but it pulls some content from the database, it plugs it into the page, and it generates a page that the web browser can understand, and it sends it back to the user. At no time does a user see or understand or ever get to look at the PHP code that's in this page, because this PHP code, it stays on the server. So this language was popular, and then they had the .com boom, and everybody wanted a website, and PHP was available. and it was great for building dynamic websites because we this was uh, the early days before Web 2.0. We were just, you know, it was the Wild West, and people were just going crazy building sites, and they just needed um, quick language that made sense. Maybe it wasn't the best way to do things, but it was a it was the best it was the best solution at the time. So now everybody's using it, and then that's why people are mad. Why does everybody use PHP? Because it was available, and it just works. If it's if it's stupid and it works, then it's not stupid. But people are always pissed off. So the main argument, why doesn't it work? Because it's not a framework. So people are like, well, you use PHP as a general purpose framework. And a framework, as I discussed in the previous presentation, is we get this huge bundle of code and we build our, so there's, all kinds of code for the framework that adds functionality and libraries and subroutines. And then within that, we build our app. And so everybody's like, well, why do I need all this stuff? Why can't I just build my app the way it is and forget about the framework? And you don't always need a framework. You don't always need the baggage of a framework. A framework introduces um, overhead because you have to pay for a server that runs a framework, and you have to pay for, you have to worry about security with respect to the increased code base that you're using. You're talking sometimes a million lines of code in the framework for an application that's 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 lines of code. There's no way to properly evaluate the security of the framework. And then they'll say, well, we don't like PHP because it's not object oriented. Everybody wants to use object oriented programming now, and they ignore the fact that PHP is object oriented and procedural at the same time. You can use whatever style makes sense to you. And they're also snobs. They say, well, anybody can use it, so it's easy to write code in PHP. So everybody's writing code in PHP, and it's easy to write bad code that still works. But that's true of any language, and it's easy to write insecure code, but that's true of any language. And when you're relying on a huge framework on top of your code, then you've got a framework to worry about. That's the product of thousands of other people's work. So there's 1,000 times risk that there's a security hole in a framework as compared to a small application. I mean, that's just common sense. And then they hate the fact that PHP has what we call weak typing, which is true. It does. We don't declare variables. So if I if I have a box, and this is, I'm gonna, some user is typing some data into my program, I don't have to go, declare string for as variable type string. And this is just pseudocode. So I'm telling the computer I'm making a string for I'm making a variable calling it string 4, and it's going to hold the string data. I don't have to do that. I just go input string 4. Now I've done 3 things with this one statement. I've created the string variable. I've used the string to catch some input, and I've set the type. Well, I haven't actually set the type, but PHP takes the input data and just assumes what type of data we're going to hold here once we fill the string up. This leads to errors though, because if I decide later, so PHP will hopefully choose the right type of variable to apply. If it doesn't, and I later try to run some other type of operation on this string, I'm going to be unsuccessful because I may try to execute a procedure on a string or on a variable that's the wrong type. So if I try to add a string to an integer, that's going to fail. But these kinds of errors are rare, not impossible, if you understand the type of data that you have. The only difference is when you declare a variable. If I, for example, declare this as an integer in a language that accepts integers, and the user here puts some letters, this input would fail because you can't store letters in an integer. So if I try to, so the question is, do you have proper error handling in your program? And that has nothing to do with whether your program, your choice of programming languages declares a variable. If you know what data is coming in, you can sanitize your data. And you have to sanitize your data. Doesn't matter what language you're using, you have to sanitize your data so that people don't aren't able to create injection attacks or other types of attacks, and so that your program doesn't suffer from fatal errors. So the dreaded 2 equal signs that everybody hates. So for whatever stupid reason, if we look at PHP, there's a few weird things here. So if I wrote the string foo, it is equal to true. Any string is equal to true in PHP, but any string is also equal to the number 0. So when this is a boolean, so this is a string here, and this is bool type, and this is an integer type. So logic would say that foo should be equal to 1 when we have an integer, but PHP is weird, so PHP sets it to 0, and that was a choice that the creators of PHP made, so that we couldn't add strings, so that strings don't have an integer value. So if that's true, then if foo is equal to true and foo is equal to 0, then true should also be equal to 0. But true is not equal to 0 because true is a bool, so bool true is equal to 1, which it has to be because false is equal to 0. And we need to be able to, in some cases, convert a Boolean variable to a integer value. So So this has to make sense, and this has to make sense. And people always show this as an example of why PHP sucks, but there's a reason behind it. Now, the second thing is we compare integers. So this is an integer. So 123 is equal to the string 123 ABC. And the reason is that when PHP is trying to compare an integer with a string, it's just looking at whether the integer matches the first part of the string, which it does. But the string 123 does not equal to the string 123 ABC. And the reason is obviously these are two different strings. So people get annoyed with that, but you can't make an integer and call that contains the content 123 ABC. That just, you can't put letters into an integer. So obviously this can't make sense. The two strings would be equal when they're not equal. Then we got these weird things. So the number 6 in a string is equal to the number 6 with a space before it. And then the number 4.2 in a string is equal to 4.200. So sometimes PHP switches to comparing numbers. Same that the number 133 compares is equal to 0133, but so when comparing strings, these are actually quite weird. You have to be careful. When comparing 133 as an integer, it's not equal to 0133. And the reason is because this represents a character. A character code in a set. And then one thing that we get a lot of criticism for is that the PHP has a ton of things called constructs, which are things that look like functions but are not functions. So we've looked at arrays quite a bit. Now if I create an array, which I can do, for example, array is not a function. It just does stuff. Echo is not a function. Echo, we write the word echo and then the name of a variable, and it just displays the content of the variable to the user. So include is a tool that we use to include content from another PHP file in our script. So for example, if I have, a login script, and I've got my home page, I may not want to include, I may not want to hard code a script that's in many different pages, so I can just do an include. So include's not a function, it just does what you tell it to. But that's probably the best way of doing things. I mean, how else would you do it? And then errors kind of suck. So it's hard to understand error messages sometimes. And there's difference between errors and exceptions, and error handler and exception handler are separate. So you have to if you want to see errors, you have to turn errors on, and if you want to see exceptions, you have to turn exceptions on. And the thing that I hate about PHP is PHP.ini. So when we have a stack, we've got PHP, which is a program, and it runs on the server. And then if you go to like c/php, you find a file called php.ini, and this contains all the settings. So normally, if I got a server, I might have 5 or 8 or 10 applications running on the server. I should be able to give every application its own settings. But with PHP, I can't really do that because the settings are all in the same file. So if we modify php.ini, it applies to all of the PHP applications that are running on the server. And PHP comes with a built-in library that has thousands of functions, but sometimes if we want to use them, we have to modify the ini file. And people hate the functions because some function names are case sensitive and some are not, and some have underscores. There's also they're just not consistent the way they're named. One thing that one function that people hate is str replace because it's got an underscore, and they think there's too many functions. So for example, we've got if we're sorting a set or an array, we use sort, and if we want to sort in reverse, we use rsort, which is a separate function. They say why couldn't you just create function sort and then array and then a parameter, forward, if we sort forward, and then for example, and then we could get rid of this function. There's like 12 sort functions and 12 search functions, and each one does its own thing. And maybe that's because people who created PHP were not all working together. It's a little bit of disorganization. They also hate that there's no support for Unicode, and there's no way to reference a key within a variable. It's not allowed. And the word pi is a function. It's not a constant, but the word m pi is a constant. So m pi returns like 3.14159, whatever. Whereas pi actually calculates the value of pi. And there's a reason for that, because you may want to return pi to 3 decimal places, you may want to return it to 20 decimal places. And it hates the fact that we can use the arrow operator only in the for each function. So for each array as value, and do something. And then we can only use an array. We can use an array as an ordered list, as a hash, as a set. The behavior is not clear, and we can't create a 0 length array, so I can't do array equals array, for example. I gotta have some value to this array. Can't create an empty array. And again, as I said, we can't have a separate INI file for each application. We have to have one INI for the entire server, and that means every application, PHP behaves the same way in every application, which is pretty irritating. Any questions? Please leave a comment.